This week on Quadriga, a world without nuclear weapons? Just a dream? Here's a man with a vision. President Barack Obama headed to the Nuclear Security Summit this week to try and rid the world of nuclear weapons. He warned Iran and North Korea that time is running out for them to rein in their nuclear ambitions. And he's also tackled the difficult question of reducing the nuclear arsenals of both Russia and the United States. The summit was a small step towards a nuclear-free world, but it looks like Obama still has many of those ahead of him. Your host on today's show is Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Is a world free of nuclear weapons feasible? And if so, how could this be achieved? And by when? These are some of the questions we're going to address on today's program. And for that, I am joined, as always, by three experts. Michael Stürmer is the chief correspondent for the German national daily newspaper Die Welt. Previously, he was the director of the government think tank for strategic affairs. Joachim Krause is professor for international relations at the Christian Albrecht University in Kiel. He is also the director of the Institute for Security Policy at the University of Kiel. And Andrew B. Dennison, the American political scientist, is the director of the think tank Transatlantic Networks and an expert on foreign policy and security issues. Well, Michael Stürmer, we just saw the summits in Korea and South Korea. President Obama labeled it as quite successful. Would you agree?
Well, politicians habitually call what they do successful. You would very rarely come back from a summit and say most somber, as Kennedy did in 1961 when he had met Khrushchev, and it was most somber and very ominous. So it's all right to say we had success as long as you don't specify success. Now, this was not about global zero. This was about preventing criminals being armed or terrorists being armed with nuclear weapons, which is the ultimate nightmare. But we are coming back to global zero. I'm not a great believer in global zero. The world was global zero from Cain and Abel, the two brothers, who had an unhappy meeting, and until Hiroshima. And what a lovely world it was. So nuclear weapons make a difference for better or for worse.
And of course, we will talk in more detail about
Cain and Abel.
The dangers, not so much about Cain and Abel. I think that would throw us way back, but certainly about the summit and the more specific goals of the summit. But Joachim Krause, do you think that such summits are useful?
Yeah, this summit had a specific goal. It was to, coordinate international efforts to control nuclear material, not just nuclear weapons material, but nuclear material. And there are a lot of outlets for nuclear material for various kind of peoples to get a hold on. So I think this was the main purpose, and it was a very small step towards the whole purpose of global zero, which we should discuss later, and sure. It's just a small measure, nothing more. And the big things are, what is about the competition between the U.S. and Russia, which is still there. They are still in the Cold War mode with regard to nuclear weapons. They still are threatening each other. And what is about the U.S.-China competition, and what about Iran and North Korea? These are the big questions.
And certainly we will look in more detail about the U.S.-Russian relationships as far as nuclear disarmament is concerned. But Andrew Dennison, again, the questions from the onset, is a world free of nuclear weapons possible?
Well, I think Americans have had a problem with nuclear weapons ever since Robert Oppenheimer said, "I am death, destroyer of worlds," as on July 18th, 1945, he watched the first nuclear weapon detonate in the deserts of New Mexico. Americans have always had a problem with nuclear weapons. However, they have had more of a problem with other people's nuclear weapons than their own. Other people's nuclear weapons are more of a problem. And even today, Barack Obama says, on the one hand, as he did here in Berlin before he was elected, in front of 200,000 people, he said, "I want a world without nuclear weapons." He afterwards said, it might not occur in my lifetime. I want a world without nuclear weapons, has been his goal. At the same time, Obama says, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective deterrent that maintains strategic stability vis-a-vis the other nuclear powers, that deters adversaries, and that reassures American friends like Germany or South Korea or Japan that American security commitments are sufficient. So on the one hand, Obama does want a world without nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I don't think he's in any hurry to get there. Now, Obama also said in Berlin, in front of the victory column, that he wanted to secure all loose nuclear materials. That is, the uranium, in particular, highly enriched uranium, that terrorists could use to make either a dirty bomb, TNT with radioactive waste, or a crude nuclear weapon, or something perhaps of that sort. So that has been a concern of his from the beginning. And he's on his way there, but I think he recognizes, as well as anyone, that it's a long path.
Well, Michael Stürmer, Andrew Dennison just mentioned that nuclear weapons might be quite effective as a deterrent. And one could argue that, for instance, India and Pakistan have not been at war with each other, at least not on a militarily field, if you will, ever since both countries developed nuclear weapons. So would you agree with the assessment that nuclear weapons are an effective tool for deterrent?
Well, that's what we've always maintained, and I still believe that is true. They deter the use of chemical and biological and radiological weapons. Insofar, they have a positive impact. The problem starts not really between the USSR, the former USSR, because it all comes from the legacy. It's a big legacy problem of the Cold War, but neither side, US or Russia, would give up. The Russians, in their strategic guidelines, are very clear. They have thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, and my hunch is, and I'm not alone, that this has something to do with the vast empty spaces of Siberia, which they cannot defend conventionally. There is, of course, an element today that many missions which were reserved during the Cold War for nuclear weapons can now be taken care of by more conventional, high-tech, super high-tech technology. So it is a problem of many parts, but the hardcore is what Professor Krause said, try to prevent the bad guys from getting at nuclear material. We've had very, very serious war games concerning nuclear material, and this could, in fact, paralyze civilized life in the industrial world to an unimaginable extent.
And talking of bad guys, if you will, of course, more than 50 states came together in South Korea together at the summit. But it were really two countries that were not there that dominated the headlines. Let's have a look.
North Korea and Iran were not on the gas list at Seoul, but that didn't stop them from making it onto the agenda. The summit was overshadowed by news that North Korea plans to fire a long-range rocket next month. It says the goal is to put a satellite into orbit. But the US sees it as a front to test nuclear missiles.
They need to understand that bad behavior will not be rewarded.
But that warning fell short of persuading the country's leaders to call off the launch. Obama also fired a warning to Iran, saying that time is running out for it to abandon its nuclear program.
Iran must act with the seriousness and sense of urgency that this moment demands. Iran must meet its obligations.
But with North Korea ignoring his ultimatum and Iran also showing no signs of backing down, some say the coming months will bring the ultimate test of Obama's nuclear agenda.
Well, Joachim Krause, we just saw more than 50 states gather together in South Korea, but North Korea and Iran did not. What do you make of this?
Yeah, most states of the world are ready to denounce nuclear weapons on a permanent basis. And I think this is very important. But there are very few states, and to them belong North Korea and Iran, who do not denounce nuclear weapons, who want to keep nuclear weapons for various purposes, mainly for the regime survival, or in the case of Iran, this is just an instrument in order to further their influence in the region. And they have made crazy statements as to wiping out Israel, which makes, in particular, Israel, in particular us in Europe and the US, very concerned, because in a couple of years they might be able to wipe out Israel with a very few.
They may mean what they say.
Yeah, they may mean what they say, and so this must make us very concerned. North Korea is a little bit different. North Korean system is so much, ruined. They're so going down the drain in their internal system, and so it's hard to understand. But it seems to be that they want to survive, and that they want to get in cash in order to sometimes to give up the program. Sometimes they start it again, and this is one of the reasons the American administration has lost all its patience with the North Koreans, because since 1993 they're negotiating with North Korea, and they found agreements, and North Korea promised to give up their nuclear weapons, and they reneged on this. And since February 29, there's an agreement between the US and America that the North Koreans will give up missile launches, that they will give up the Iranian program, that they will give up other nuclear activities. And all of a sudden, they indicate that they want to make a peaceful missile test. And everybody knows the technology of missiles is the same, whether they have peaceful purposes or non-peaceful purposes. And there have already been offers made to them that someone else could put their satellite into space. But they have ignored these advices. The Russians have made this offer. So we all sit there and marvel what are their intentions. And against the backdrop of the recent change in power, I think the main point or the main conclusion I draw is that there is not yet a clear-cut solution in North Korea who's in control of power.
Andrew Dennison, what is North Korea's motivation here? At the end of the day, this is a country that is stricken with poverty. Certainly its people are starving, and yet somehow miraculously the money is being found to launch a satellite into orbit. Why?
Well, we never know what goes on in the minds of crazy dictators like Kim Jong-un, I believe is his name, the son of Kim Jong-il. But I would venture to guess that regime survival, not just the person at the top, but all of his cronies, hundreds of thousands of people who benefit from his power, regime survival, in the sense that a regime change from the outside becomes much more difficult. Now, North Korea always had South Korea as a hostage, if you will, because of thousands of artillery pieces within range of Seoul. So then you wonder, well, regime survival was kind of already guaranteed. They had a way to keep the West at bay since the end of the war in '54. What else might it be? And there you come into issues, I think, of status, that if the regime thinks its people are proud of its technical accomplishments, they might complain less about being hungry. I don't see it as a sustainable goal. And I think Korea is the clearest example of why the kind of government you have makes all the difference in the world. South Korea, prosperous, rule-abiding, human rights-respecting country, same kind of people, same color of skin, same religion, same history. North Korea impoverished under dictatorship.
Well, Michael Stürmer, to play devil's advocate here, North Korea is not signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to the NPT.
It was.
They were.
It was. It was.
It was, but they withdrew.
They were, then they withdrew. They reaped the benefits, and then they withdrew. They were massively supported, of course, by the Russians. Most of their technology goes back to Russian technology. Russian technology goes back to German technology at the end of the Second World War, especially missile technology. So the evil is spreading. One thing I wanted to throw into the discussion is, of course, a nuclear weapon does not only change minds and behavior once it is fired. Nuclear weapons, through their very presence, do make a difference. During the Cold War, we had a world structure organized by through nuclear weapons, and not a single one was ever fired in anger. We had tests and test ban treaty and all kinds of things, but nuclear weapons forced the superpowers into a mode which our forefathers would not have even imagined in their wildest fantasies, into a mode of coexistence. They had to, in a way, they were united, they were silent allies in preventing not only war amongst themselves, but also preventing other powers, minor powers, acquiring nuclear weapons or even the chance to build nuclear weapons. We are living here in a world. You don't have to activate the Big Bang to give it an enormous impact on world affairs and interstate relations.
So the mere presence of nuclear weapons...
It's a fleet in being.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it did not prevent the Soviet Union at the time of the Cold War to try to build up a non-nuclear posture, which would have allowed them to overrun Western Europe within 1 week. Though there was the presence of the nuclear umbrella, but attempts were there to be made in order to make it ineffective. And this is something we should have in mind too, because nuclear weapons, they are weapons of last resort. That means that you might have different resorts before you have the last resort, and this is always something we have to take into account. Also with regard to North Korea, because I've made some inquiry into the conventional relationship on the Korean Peninsula. And this interesting thing is that South Korea is gaining more and more strength vis-à-vis North Korea. The artillery pieces which are threatening Seoul, they are under the threat of South Korean aircraft, and very effective threat. So I don't think this is anymore a real threat to South Korea. And surprisingly, since 2010, the North Koreans have stopped provoking the South Koreans, with firing artillery shells and so on.
No more sea of fire.
Yeah.
That was the threat. We'll turn you into a sea of fire.
Yeah, but
doesn't sound very reassuring.
Yeah, but the South Koreans, they are now much more able to turn this to initiate this sea of fire. And so the overall balance of non-nuclear forces is changing, and I have no idea how operational really the North Korean nuclear weapons are. They made 2 tests, and the first was basically a failed test. The second was half-failed test. Nobody knows whether they have an operational nuclear weapons. So if I were North Korean, I would be much more cautious, because at the end they come out with, South Korea becoming more and more independent in their military the ability to act independently. Secondly, they are becoming more and more dominant. And thirdly, the nuclear guarantee they have by their own nuclear weapons is not very assuring. And fourthly, China is more and more shifting towards South Korea. This is also something. The North Koreans have the Chinese, the big body in their backyard, which could help them against the big body, the USA. But if there is a small body, South Korea taking over, things might look different. So I think in the coming years, the next 10 years or so, the Korean issue might become a little bit different than it has been so far.
Andrew Dennison, is China to pick up the ball? Is China exerting enough pressure on North Korea?
No. No, they could certainly exert a lot more. They have concerns. They don't want a unified Korea. They don't want the government collapsing, lots of refugees coming through. Instability on the Korean peninsula means less investment in China. And so I think they want to keep everything as safe, as stable as possible, kick the can down the road. Now, I think a couple of points, again, need to be made. One is Herr Krause talked about the advancing conventional non-nuclear capability with precision and high explosives, ground-penetrating ordnance. You can do things today that before you could only do with nuclear weapons. That explains why the West that has a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons is nevertheless interested in reducing the role of nuclear weapons in global security, because the West increasingly has an advantage in high-tech network precision warfare. The poorer countries are the ones that have the advantage with nuclear weapons. That said, I do think that Obama is more concerned about a nuclear weapon in the hand of a terrorist than he is about a nuclear weapon in the hand of the North Korean government or perhaps in the future the Iranian government. Now, if North Korea and Iran build nuclear technologies, then the West certainly should use every opportunity to put pressure on them. But it's not the real threat. I think Obama wakes up every day and he thinks, God dang it, if some of that technology slipped out and someone had a couple of kilograms of highly enriched uranium, they could really, they could make a bomb that would destroy 3-4 square miles of Washington, D.C., or Berlin from the Alexanderplatz to the Bahnhof Zoo. Boom. And that irrational terrorist actor, I think that makes people a lot more fearful. We shouldn't forget, in Germany, there's uranium enrichment, Urenco and Jülich, connected to a company in Holland. Their centrifuge design in the 60s was stolen by a Pakistani scientist, A.Q. Khan, and he sold those designs to Libya and to other countries. The centrifuges that are being used in Iran today are from designs out of Europe. So Obama's initiative in April of 2010 to start the nuclear security summits, their continuation this year and then in 2014 in Holland, has set up a global security architecture for trying to lock down that loose nuclear material. Because there's a lot more highly enriched uranium, well, until just recently in countries like the Ukraine or Kazakhstan than in Iran. So just to keep things in perspective, we put pressure on Iran and North Korea because they give us an opportunity to do so. But the real fear every morning when Obama wakes up is the nuclear terrorist.
Well, nuclear terrorists, Michael Stürmer, President Obama has said that he wants to account and secure all nuclear materials worldwide by the year 2014. How realistic is that?
Not very realistic. It is, in fact, unlikely because we have this wide range from scattered materials from hospital, you have a lot of nuclear medicine around. There are always remnants, leftovers, and you have this wide range from those leftovers to a kilo of plutonium, which could wreak havoc. And in between you have all the military, organized, controlled, big machinery, which is probably the least worrisome problem. It's the edges. It's on the edges, and that is not a marginal problem, although it sounds like a contradiction in itself. It could be very central, as Mr. Dennison has just said. So it's not very realistic. However, we must try. We must do everything we can do. There will always be a residual problem, but we have to minimize it as much as we can. It means a lot of togetherness, a lot of common purpose, a lot of trust building, confidence building, trust building. A lot of money must go into these things. And we'll probably have to have a huge bureaucracy. At present, the Vienna-based International Agency for Nuclear Material, IAEA, has something like between 3,000 and 4,000 people. Probably that's not enough because you want to have on-site inspections. It's not good enough just to study the publication of the ISS and then point some fingers. No. You have to really go out and control what's happening.
Well, Joachim Krause, as Andrew Dennison said, the one thing that keeps Obama awake at night, perhaps not the only thing, but certainly one of the things that keep him awake at night is the fear of nuclear terrorism. Yeah. How real is this threat?
It is not so imminent as most people describe it. For one of the reasons is it was not Obama who first identified this problem. It was Senator Nana Lugar in 1990 already. And they initiated the non-Lugar legislation, and from that, you know,
to secure the Soviet,
in the former Soviet Union, it was then extended to other countries. Then in 2001, the other G8 countries joined in the so-called global partnership, and the record is very impressive since then. So this is the reason why he named the year 2014 as the year in which all these various efforts, and they have invested billions of dollars or euro in this, will be finished successfully. The point is we have some exceptions on this. One exception is Pakistan, one is Iran, and the other is North Korea, and maybe also Israel. We don't know it exactly. But Israel is not a problem because they control this. And these are the main problems. But the terrorist threats, I think they have been overestimated or they have been materially reduced, because there's so much nuclear material which is meanwhile under control, be it the Russian authorities, be it American authorities, or IAEA, which does play not such a big role in this.
So the making of a dirty bomb, so-called dirty bomb, then you don't foresee this to happen anytime soon?
A dirty bomb is not a nuclear bomb. A dirty bomb is a normal explosive which is, you know, mixed with some radioactive components.
And it causes contamination.
It causes some kind of contamination depending on what kind of radioactive substance you have. There are some substances which are very dangerous, others which just produce radiation, which is threatening the people, but it's not something that is very dangerous. So, so far we have seen that some terrorist groups, in particular Al-Qaeda, had shown an interest, but on the other hand, it has also shown that they are far away from being able to manufacture any kind of nuclear weapons or even to get access to nuclear weapons material. And on the other hand, even if they were able, there are so many regulations meanwhile, like the Container Security Initiative, which make it virtually impossible to smuggle nuclear weapons which are being produced somewhere in Central Asia, are being shipped to the US or to Europe. It's very difficult.
You already mentioned the Pakistani scientist, by now infamous scientist, Khan, who indeed engaged in espionage. So my question is this. He then transferred the knowledge to Iran and Libya. Do we foresee any of these cases to happen in other countries as well?
That's certainly a concern.
Espionage.
And the communique of the Seoul Summit also talked about information security. You don't want cyber attacks stealing information or shutting down nuclear plant cooling systems either. But you also want to keep those kind of technologies under control, not let them out. Just a couple of general points, too, about this Security Summit. We should remember that when 50 countries come together and say, we think you need to have better control over your nuclear materials, it's easier for countries like Pakistan to say okay than when just the United States goes in and says, Uncle Sam wants you to do that. So Obama, leading from behind, says if we get a big group of people who regularly meet and talk about these things, the political pressure is more potent. Okay. Now, I do think that we should make a distinction between a crude nuclear weapon, which is very difficult, and the dirty bomb that you talked about. If you had 50 pounds of TNT and 50 pounds of radioactive waste from a research reactor, and you set that off in downtown Manhattan, people would be terrified. Just the fear of the radiation in the air. And it would be a catastrophe like the United States has never seen. So I think there is a concern that a low-tech, dirty bomb is still something we really need to be very worried about.
So certainly the mission to secure and account for all nuclear materials, perhaps not by the year 2014, but certainly beyond, is very important. And according to the Federation of American Scientists, there are still 20,000 nuclear warheads today. Out of those, approximately 5,000 operational. And the bulk of these 5,000 operational nuclear warheads belong to the US and Russia. So the importance of that bilateral relations as far as disarmament is concerned is very imminent. Let's have a look.
They may possess more than 95% of the world's nuclear weapons. But in Seoul, President Obama was talking arms cuts with his Russian counterpart, Dmitry Medvedev. Obama said he's committed to slashing his nation's stockpile of nuclear weapons.
We can already say with confidence that we have more nuclear weapons than we need.
But in the run-up to the summit, it looked like his nuclear agenda was losing steam as presidential elections loom on the horizon. In Seoul, he was overheard promising President Medvedev more flexibility after the election in November, a sign there'll be no major breakthroughs until a second term is in the bag. But first, he'll have to take on Russia's Prime Minister Vladimir Putin when the two meet at the G8 summit in May. There, Obama will have to tackle the tricky question of how many nuclear warheads the US and Russia really need. Some say the outcome of those talks will prove whether Obama's nuke-free vision is more dream or reality.
Well, Michael Stürmer, more dream than reality?
No, they will build down for a very simple reason. When is enough? Anything above a few hundred is probably enough. They have agreed to build down to 1,500 each. That may not be enough for the Russian military mind because of the vast empty spaces of Asia, but it is plenty and enough for any imaginable emergency that may arise. And these nuclear weapons are not like bullets you put into a box and you take them out 20 years later and they'll function. Oh no, nuclear weapons are living things. They deteriorate, they age, and the Russian arsenals are aging very rapidly, and most are probably no longer operational. So it is in the interest of the Russians to cut down and make the Americans cut down, because the Americans can still afford to keep them all operational, all these vast numbers. So I would say logic and the national interest of both the United States and the Russians and the rest of the world argues for building down to 1,500, not to zero. That is a dream. And probably will remain a dream for any foreseeable future, but 1,500 each side, plus, of course, the arsenals of China, France, Britain, which have also, the latter, have been reduced, plus, but they are outside that regime because they are small.
Well, Joachim Krause, as we saw, the US and Russia certainly pledged to disarm. At a time, though, when China is upgrading its nuclear arsenal, isn't it true?
Yeah, the arsenals of the US and Russia are much sizable, much larger than those of China, so there's some latitude. And the Chinese argue that they so far have only limited nuclear arsenals, limited strategic arsenals. So from their perspective, it's logical that they catch up a little bit, but they are not on the same level. And it has been discussed in the past that China should be involved in the US and Russian discussion. But, everything is much more complicated because you have to discern between strategic weapons. These are those weapons with which the US and Russia can threaten each other. And then you have the non-strategic weapons Michael Stürmer was referring to. For the Russians, the non-strategic weapons are much more important, meanwhile, because they could help them in overcoming the deficiency in defending their huge country. So they do not aim at American targets. They aim at China. They aim at possible other adversaries in the region. But for the US and Russian competition, it's amazing to see that 20 years after the end of the Cold War, they are still, threatening each other with weapons, with nuclear weapons, with more than 1,500 nuclear weapons, which are on a relatively high status of alert. It's a remnant of the Cold War. The question is, why aren't they able to go down to 100 or 200 things? There's a simple answer to this. It's stability, nuclear stability, because there's a simple law of nuclear stability. If you have two adversaries who are threatening each other on a short-term alert with nuclear weapons. The most stable situation is where both have many nuclear weapons. The most unstable situation is one in which there were only very few nuclear weapons, because then there's a danger that someone might disarm the other one. So the problem is here, I think both could make do with less than 1,500, how to arrange for some kind of stability which goes lower and lower. And so far, both sides have not found out a formula for this. And this explains why more than 20 years after the end of the Cold War, there's still a nuclear standoff between both of them on which, very high alert weapons.
So, Andrew Dennison, then Obama, we just heard him say that the U.S. has enough weapons, enough nuclear material, enough nuclear weapons, more than it needs, in fact, he was saying. But so the option, the possibility of a disarmament to zero then, if I understand Joachim Krause, then is not very realistic, is it?
It's kind of like the goal of perfect health. It's an admirable goal, but you're not going to reach it for a long time. But it's a great
in the end,
way.
you're dead.
Exactly. I mean, Obama said here in Berlin, it may not happen in my lifetime. But it's an admirable goal. At some point, in the world of our grandchildren, maybe we'll have some sort of global society that actually achieves that. In the short term, it's a great way to put political pressure on the nuclear wannabes from Iran to Pakistan, India. Because you say, we want to go world without nuclear weapons, WWNW, that's the promise, world without nuclear weapons. We want to go there, so please don't build while we're doing that. And I think that is a significant step. Now, we heard Obama on an open mic say that after the election, his last election, he will be more flexible. In the election in the United States, of course, Republicans grabbed that and said, he's lying to us. Today, he says he won't make concessions to the Russians, but after the election, he will. Bad for campaign politics, but very good diplomacy. If I was talking to Medvedev, I'd say, too, I can't give you these concessions now. Wait a little bit, how it is with elections. It's like my kid, he says, I'll do my homework later instead of now. And I think in that sense, it's very good. And he also did get a little cut in there, too. He said, I only have one more election. He was implying that Putin might still be president of Russia when Obama's children are grown up. So, yeah, from a political campaign perspective, maybe a little difficult, but I think it showed Obama's pretty good at diplomacy.
Well, open mics, as we saw, can be rather dangerous unless you're on Quadriga, of course. Michael Stürmer, Iran. Iran is an issue certainly on the minds of the international community.
Absolutely. That's where it should be. It is very, very worrying indeed, because, it's one more nuclear player, which is a bad thing in itself. It is a regime that is very difficult to read its mind. It is a regime that threatens the destruction of Israel. It is a regime that is hated and distrusted by most of the Arabs. And, of course, the main purpose is of this nuclear build-up, which has come via North Korea and Dr. Khan's network. The main purpose is to get the Americans out of the Gulf area as the superpower, to, anyway, impress and oppress the Arabs, and to guarantee, although I don't really see how this could be done, to guarantee the eternal survival of a very unpleasant regime. So this is a really very worrying situation, and it comes on top of the fact that for the last more than 30 years, the greater Middle East has been the source of enormous commotions. You could call them revolutions.
Joachim Krause, Iran certainly on the minds of the international community, though Tehran is saying it is enriching uranium for peaceful purposes only. Can we trust Iran?
No, because it's hard to see which peaceful purposes they are actually pursuing, because they have one nuclear reactor, but this nuclear reactor runs on lightly enriched uranium that is being delivered by Russia. So what is the purpose of this? And this is the reason the so-called international community, whatever that means we, our governments, other governments, are very much concerned about the real purpose of this. And I think all agree, meanwhile, that the real purpose is to make the country ready to start a nuclear weapons production. They have not made the full decision, and we know it takes them 1 to 1.5 years after they have made the decision to have nuclear weapons available. And this is exactly what we are so much afraid of. This is not a peaceful purpose program. It is a military purpose program.
Andrew Dennison, the one country that is threatened the most by Iran's nuclear program is Israel, of course. Though, to play devil's advocate, one could argue, well, Israel has nuclear weapons.
Yeah, well, that's true, but I trust the government, the elected government of Israel, a whole lot more than I do the not a really elected government of Iran. As I always say, in Wyoming, cowboy country, not everyone is allowed to carry a gun. We don't let criminals and we don't let children have guns. If your government is responsible, it doesn't bother me if you have an enrichment facility. No one's concerned about Germany's centrifuges over in Jülich. However, I think Iran and its government, the mullahs and Ahmadinejad, should remember that the Politburo disappeared from Moscow despite an enormous nuclear arsenal. So nuclear weapons do not guarantee regime survival. I think also that Iran, at the end of the day, probably is going to drop its pursuit of nuclear weapons. I mean, what they say, we believe Iran when they say we're going to attack Israel. We don't believe them when we say we want no nuclear weapons. What we can say now is on April 14th in Geneva, talks will again begin with Iran about more safeguards, more inspections, and the possibility of a controlled program in return for the loosening of sanctions. Obama has quoted the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in saying that there actually is a prohibition because of Islam on nuclear weapons. So if Islam prohibits nuclear weapons, maybe there's a face-saving way for the government of Iran to back down on this.
Well, at least now we found out that Wyoming is a safe place to go to. Michael Stürmer, brief answer, last rounds. To go back to the initial question, is a world free of nuclear weapons possible, and if so, by when?
It is neither possible nor desirable, to put it mildly or provocatively, but we should work towards in that direction.
Joachim Krause?
I think it's theoretically possible, and what makes me a little bit more optimistic is that the U.S. no longer needs nuclear weapons, unless others have not nuclear weapons. It was the U.S. who invented nuclear weapons into the world.
Andrew Dennison, quickly?
Yeah, I think we keep working on it. The important thing is to secure the nuclear materials and convince as many countries as possible to not pursue nuclear weapons.
Well, let's keep working at it together within the international community so that President Obama's dream of a nuclear-free world can become a reality one day. I want to thank you out there for watching. I want to thank my 3 guests, and looking forward to see you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.